Chapter 8. It was said by our ancestors that the monster would come on the wings of death. Because the saying was in a song, for a long time my people thought it spoke of the past. We know now that it spoke of the future. Many things were not understood by my people. It was not understood by my grandfather and those who came before him, just how much death one monster could bring. If it could not be understood by our people, it could not be understood by those who kept my brother from that which he was supposed to slay. Under the darkness of the New Mexico sky, the night seemed like any other. The wild boar were snuffling in the dirt a mile from their previous hunting ground. The great cat that had hunted them the night before did not watch them this night. The death of the boar had reminded it that two-legged hunters sometimes killed cats, and it had decided to give that particular hunting ground a rest. It would return when the time felt right. In a small copse of trees not far from the base, another hunter considered his prey. The hunter carried 3 skulls already, human skulls, and one tiny boar skull hung from his belt. He tapped his long nails on a metal device he wore on his powerful left forearm. The time was not yet right. He would wait until it was. Several miles away, in the yard of that base, Corporal Benson sat in a running Humvee. The cool of the night air felt good. He liked New Mexico best in the dark. He was from Maine, and even though he had been stationed here for more than a year, the excessive heat still seemed unnatural to him. The only times he was comfortable were times like this, in the cool darkness. He often volunteered for pre-dawn duty. It was 4:45 in the morning, and the sun wasn't yet a hint in the eastern sky. The longer it stayed away, the happier he would be. The stars poked through the night lights of the base perimeter, invading the sky above with faint reminders of how beautiful the night sky could be. He stretched and wondered if he would be able to stay awake, even with the Humvee rattling beneath him. The vehicle had a rough idle, and when he got the chance, he would take a look at it himself. He had already complained to the grease monkeys, and they had looked at him as if he hadn't known a thing about military equipment. Maybe he didn't, but he knew something about cars, and this one, no matter what its designation, needed a little work under the hood. Maybe he would start that work now. He had been sitting here long enough, and it would serve the corporal right to be forced to wait. Benson had to do something to remain alert. He managed only about 2 hours of sleep last night, due to a poker game in the barracks laundry room. The game was going his way, as it usually did among the amateurs here, but when he finally noticed the time, around 1 a.m., he realized he still needed to lose a few hands before he left. He didn't want the boys to figure out too soon that he knew more about cards than they did, so he played for another 45 minutes, carefully giving back 1% of his take. Then he stood and made a show of being disappointed with the turn in his luck, before heading off to bed. But he really hadn't thought the day through. Now, with this transport duty followed by the new assignment of helping out in the hangar after breakfast, he was going to pay the price. At least he was richer this morning than he had been at this time yesterday. Benson stretched again, and then saw movement to the left. Corporal Nakai closed the barracks door behind him and headed down between the white stones that marked the front walk of C Barracks. He was carrying a heavy duffel over his shoulder, and he did not look happy. Most men ran to the Humvee when they were granted leave. Benson should know. He'd been assigned to the carpool for months, and had the unenviable job of shuttling anyone with a higher rank in and out of the small nearby town, at no matter what time of day or night. He was getting used to that rap on the door that signaled a new assignment. Fortunately, he had gotten this one before lights out. If it had come in the middle of the night, he would have been hard-pressed to explain his absence from his bunk. This assignment was strange, though. It was well known that the Sarge hated Nakai, and did everything he could to make the man's life miserable. That Nakai got a sudden leave and that Benson was assigned to drive him was just plain weird. Nakai was being treated like a man of higher rank, like someone important. If Benson had had to bet that someone in the barracks would get the royal treatment, he wouldn't have laid his money on Nakai. Nakai tossed his duffel bag in the back of the open Humvee and slid into the passenger seat. He was a big man who looked smaller until you sat close to him. He also had a quiet power that Benson respected. But that respect didn't stop him from giving Nakai a hard time. "I thought you were going to be here 15 minutes ago." Nakai pulled his jacket closer. "I thought you liked the early morning cold. Figured you'd want a little more time to bond with it." "I thought you had a bus to catch." "The 507 to La Barca de Oro. We still have time, don't we?" Of course they did, and Nakai knew it. Benson had a reputation for taking the Humvees out full throttle, especially this early, when no one else was on the roads. "Well, I'll see what I can do," Benson said. He swung the Humvee around and headed for the main gate. "You know, you could have taken a later bus." "You ever ridden a bus in the summer heat?" Nakai asked. "Gotcha." Benson hadn't ridden a bus in desert heat, and the thought made him sweat just thinking about it, even with the chilly night air around them. Maybe it had been Nakai's choice to leave this early. Then again, maybe not. The scuttlebutt last night at the game had Corporal Nakai leaving a post and running into the pilot of the weird craft now stored in the hangar. One of the guys had said the colonel wanted to get rid of Nakai until everything calmed down, and shipping him out this early certainly seemed to be confirmation of that rumour. The front gate guards waved them by without much more than a pause. As Benson ground the vehicle up to speed, he glanced at Nakai. "Weird how the colonel suddenly okayed your pass, isn't it?" Nakai never took his gaze off the road ahead. "Yeah, weird." He spoke in a flat monotone that led Benson to believe that he didn't think it was weird at all. "What are you gonna do?" Nakai shrugged. "The usual." The Humvee bumped over the rutted road. Benson held the steering wheel tightly, then glanced at Nakai. Nakai's face seemed purposefully blank. "Something happened yesterday." "Why?" "I've been hearing strange rumours." "There are always strange rumours," Nakai said, looking out at the scrub. He pulled his cap over his face, slumped in the seat, and didn't say another word. Benson didn't force the issue. Nakai seemed unusually tense. He wasn't sleeping, despite his posture. He was studying the dark desert on both sides of the road, as if he were watching for something. Benson kept his eyes glued to the pavement in front of him, and let the cool night air shove back some of the sleepless hours. After a while, he kicked the Humvee to high speed and enjoyed the breeze in his face. Nothing like the hours before dawn. Nothing like it at all. The small town was still asleep when Benson swung through the main street. It looked like most northern New Mexico small towns. Square, squat buildings parked in the middle of the desert. Some, like Espanola, were surrounded by trees and spectacular mesas. Most were like this one, so poor that they didn't even bother to try to hide it. Benson pulled in front of the fake adobe building with a Greyhound sign tacked to the grimy window. Nakai swung out of the vehicle, grabbed his duffel, and slung it over his shoulder. "Thanks," he said. Benson didn't know if Nakai was thanking him for the ride or for not asking questions. He suspected it was both. "See you in a few days." "I hope so," Nakai said, as he turned and walked away. Benson had no idea what those strange words meant, but he wasn't about to ask. He shrugged and swung the Humvee around. If he hurried, he'd have time for breakfast, and God knew he needed the coffee. An hour later, when Benson entered the hangar, the sight of the captured craft stopped him cold. He had seen it yesterday, but its strangeness hadn't really registered. Now, seeing it on the back of the flatbed truck, he was shocked. It didn't look man-made at all. Sitting in the rocks, it had almost blended in. Here, in the hangar, it just looked alien. Its lines and angles were unusual. Where he expected sharp corners, there were curves. Where he expected curves, there were sharp corners. Red lights, at least he thought they were lights, up front were angled like the eyes of a Siamese cat, and instead of one light on each side, there were two. In the top center of the nose, rounded metal rose, almost like hubcaps stuck on the nose for decoration. The craft wasn't yellow, wasn't orange, wasn't gold or brown, but it was a combination of the colors, all of them at the same time. It depended on where he stood, and how he stood, and the way the light hit the sides. And those sides. He wasn't sure if they were made of metal or not. They looked like they were, but not of any metal he'd ever seen. He had been gaping. He knew it. Fortunately, no one else seemed to notice. No one except the sentry who stood at the hangar's bay door. He grinned and winked as Benson shook himself. Apparently the sentries, at least, had had the same reaction. There were two other sentries standing before the doors of the hangar. Benson wondered why they were inside. He had noted guards on the outside as well. Next to the inside sentries, 3 men in white lab coats were setting up equipment. One man stood at a table on which there was a very sophisticated laptop computer. The screen was covered with a series of orange numbers that made no sense to Benson. With one more glance at the guard, Benson climbed up on the back of the truck and took up his assigned position on the lift. This much of his duty had already been explained to him. He was to help hoist the craft off the flatbed and into a specially prepared area of the hangar. Around the hangar, activity was starting to increase. From his perch he could see most of it, and since he didn't have anything to do until they decided to move the craft, he could just sit and watch. 2 of the white lab coat guys were studying the ship, moving around it slowly, making notes as they went. Another crew was working to set up the area where the ship would be placed, installing more machines and checking video equipment. The conversations were muted, but the hangar was so large that the sounds echoed and played back, almost like a reverb at a stadium rock concert. Suddenly, silence fell over the hangar as Colonel Atherley entered, followed closely by Sergeant Coates. Atherley looked tired. Even his moustache was drooping. Coates' normal red face was even redder. Both men stopped and gaped at the alien craft, just as Benson had. He shot another glance at the guard. The guard grinned. Then the colonel shook himself and elbowed the sergeant, who looked like he was coming out of a dream. They strode over to a spot below Benson, where a man in a white coat stood. "Morning, Dr. Richards," the colonel said. "Morning, sir," Richards said. Around the hangar, the activity went back to normal, but the colonel and the doctor remained close enough for Benson to hear. The doctor was far from a typical military type. He wore thick glasses, was mostly bald, and was unnaturally thin, except for a bowling ball-sized belly that made him look suspiciously like a python that had just eaten a meal. Benson hadn't seen the doctor around the base before. He must have flown in yesterday, after the craft had been found. "Any new developments yet, Doctor?" the colonel asked. "It's clearly a spacecraft of some sort or another," Dr. Richards said, handing the colonel a clipboard covered with papers. "But almost all the radioactivity indicating deep space travel has dissipated. Quite fascinating, actually." "I'm sure it is, Doctor," the colonel said, glancing through the papers the doctor had handed him. "But I'm more concerned at the moment with the questions Washington's going to be asking, such as where did it come from, is it alone, and are we in danger? Has the pilot realized that we have his craft?" Sergeant Coates added. "That also," the colonel said. Benson made himself swallow and forced himself to keep his eyes on the controls of his lift. The air was caught in his throat. He was sitting next to a radioactive alien spacecraft. What the hell were they doing to him? He almost jumped down from the lift, then managed to calm his nerves. The doctor had said the radioactivity had faded. Clearly, since the colonel and the doctor were standing closer to the craft than he was, he would be all right. With another deep breath, he felt himself relax a little more. He was going to have to be calm when he worked the lift, that much was for sure. They didn't need him dropping the alien ship. Below him, the colonel kept studying the papers the doctor had handed him. Benson had no idea if the colonel and the sarge knew he could hear them, but he was sure he wasn't supposed to be hearing them, especially if they thought this might be an alien craft. God, he'd heard about this crap before, but that's what he thought it was. Crap. He'd seen the fake TV shows about extraterrestrials, and he decided that people were gullible enough to fall for anything. Until now. The ship glimmered in the light. He squinted at the sides. He was right. It was not yellow, orange, gold, or brown. It was a colour he'd never seen before. One he couldn't even describe. A shiver ran through him, and he swallowed hard. This whole thing unnerved him. Just as the colonel finished reading, a side door of the hangar opened, and Sergeant Redmond stepped in at a fast walk. Redmond had been Benson's sergeant for almost 6 months. He was a good but strict sarge. Benson preferred him to Coates. Redmond was dressed in full battle gear and had his rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked more worried than Benson had ever seen him. Redmond hesitated slightly when he saw the alien craft, then went right up to the colonel and saluted. "Sir, we found Dietl, Lee, and Clowes." He hesitated a moment, then said, "All dead, sir." Benson cursed, softly to himself. He had liked Clowes. Liked him a lot, actually. He had played a lot of hands of poker against Clowes. The guy had been good. The colonel turned. He didn't even look surprised. Benson felt his own chill grow. The colonel had already known they were dead. But how? "What took so long to find them?" he asked. Sergeant Redmond took a deep breath, then glanced up at the alien craft before going on. "All 3 were hung from the trees near the tank placement. They were skinned, sir." "Skinned?" Sergeant Coates asked. "Skinned," Redmond answered. "And their heads are missing. It's not a pretty sight." Benson swallowed hard. Jesus, what had he gotten into the middle of? "Have you secured the area?" the colonel asked. "We have," Redmond said. "But the men are jumpy, sir. Real jumpy." "We all are," the colonel said. "Keep the area under wraps and get the med boys out there." "Yes, sir," Redmond said, saluted, and left. "Holy shit," Sergeant Coates said, more to himself than anyone else. Benson couldn't have agreed more. The colonel took a deep breath, then turned to Dr. Richards. "I need answers, and I need them quickly." "We're doing our best," the doctor said. He appeared to be the only one who was calm. Of course he would be. He hadn't known any of the men. Benson had known them all. He was shaking, and his palms were damp. Damn. He wished he had found a way to get out of this duty. He was beginning to envy Nakai. He would have loved a 3-day leave. This seemed like a good place to get out of. "Doctor!" The shout interrupted the conversation. Benson glanced down on the other side of the alien craft. One of the other men in a white coat was yelling for the doctor to come and look at something. This one was a short guy, with black hair and no chin. And right at the moment he seemed as excited as if he'd just won the lottery. The doctor, the colonel, and 2 sergeants still all moved around to the other side of the alien craft. "Doctor," the short guy said, "we've got activity from the ship." He pointed up to a row of lights. From Benson's position on top of the lift, he could see that red lights had appeared on the side and the top of the alien craft. A row of them, blinking. Benson was sure they hadn't been there just a moment before. As Benson watched, one of the red lights on the end of the row stopped blinking and went dark. The row got shorter. Then a moment later, another light went out. There were only 6 blinking red lights left. The line of red lights was getting shorter and shorter. Suddenly, Benson knew what was happening and what those red lights meant. "I don't like the look of this," the doctor said. Benson couldn't help himself anymore. He leaned over the lift controls and yelled, "It looks like a countdown!" 5 red lights were left. The Sarge looked up and frowned at him, but at that moment Benson didn't care in the slightest. He didn't want to be sitting on top of the stupid lift when the last red light went out. He swung off the lift and scrambled down. 4 red lights left. "I think the corporal is right," the doctor said. "It does appear to be a countdown." 3 red lights blinked their warning. Benson hit the floor of the hangar and took off running. Behind him, the colonel shouted, "Everyone get down!" 2 red lights. Around Benson, men scrambled for cover. Benson dove in behind a large truck and rolled to a position behind a tire. 1 red light blinked on the side of the alien ship. 1 small red light. And then it too went out. There was a click, a very loud click that echoed through the large hangar. And that click was the last thing anyone in that hangar heard. Within a fraction of a second, the entire base was wiped off the face of the planet. Corporal Benson, Sergeant Coates, Colonel Atherley, and the other 1,000 or so men and women stationed in the New Mexico desert didn't even know what hit them. They died instantly, vaporized into a grey dust that over the years would scatter across the desert and mix with the red sand and dirt. In a tree 3 miles away, the hunter watched the dust cloud rise to the sky. 40 miles away, on an old Greyhound bus 30 minutes short of its destination, Corporal Nakai dozed, his head banging slightly against the dirty glass. His dreams were of the hunt. His dreams were of his grandfather. His dreams were of a dead brother he didn't even know.